So, in general, this agenda that Russia seriously is parasitizing upon, that last interview by Dugin that he gave to Tucker Carlson, he was touching upon all of these basic topics that are aimed at the heart of American and Western conservatives at large, which he was trying to use to play the combinations related to the fears that Western conservatives have been feeling for the last several decades, as different disproportions, economic, ideological, political, and he and Putin's Russia are trying to change that balance of powers on the global West in their favor, using these levers. And I think we should accentuate that topic today, because when in the United States they were listening to this interview with Dugin, many of them had an awakening call to the differences of their understanding of conservatism and human nature, because Dugin basically accused the West in destroying collective identity, and accordingly there is a ramp up to building of totalitarian society in the leftist fashion of it, or liberalist fashion of it. And Russia is the only protector of conservative values. That's a brief retelling of that interview. I hope you watched it, Alexei. Yeah, I did. Okay, I think it's important to highlight what Russian conservatism is in today's stream versus the Western conservatism. Because there are people who still are sane in Russia. Not all of them have left. They're saying that generally we are overestimating or exaggerating what is happening in Russia to be a serious ideology, because everything is just a Potemkin village and a facade for stealing from the budget, and basically portraying a class-divided society, which modern Russia is, that has survived Soviet Union, the fall of Soviet Union, and has its roots back in the Russian Empire, Moscow Kingdom. That's why those who still have rational attitude in Russia, they're basically saying everything is corrupt to the core, everything is rotten. You guys on the West are exaggerating, thinking that it has any depth. So what do you think, Alexei? Are we exaggerating the depth of Russian conservatism, or underestimating it perhaps? That's first question. And second, you being on the West, what key differences do you see between the Russian conservative narratives and, let's say, American conservative ideology? All right, let's start with the definition, Yuri. Conservatism on the West carries the definition that it stands to protect the eternal values that humanity keeps. Now, what these values are, that differs. There is also another definition that was given by Roger Scruton, one of the main conservative ideologists in the West. He recently deceased. He said that conservatism is protecting everything that's valuable and worthy in the old Europe. And in the West, overall, I would say they understand conservatism to be the general protection of the ideas and principles of old Europe and or old America. And in Russia, conservatism protects the principles of old Russia. And that's where the differences start to show up. They also have one thing in common. Before we go into differences, they all hate the leftists. They fight with them tooth and nail. Now let's go into the differences. And the differences are between old Europe and old America. But altogether they are about rights and freedoms of a person. This is a long and difficult story of fighting for rights and freedoms of an individual. Now, what is old Russia? If we ask this question of those Russian conservatives, what it stands upon? It stands upon an understanding that it has its own path. They have a pretense for their own special type civilization, not Western nor Eastern, something very different in their view. It is also very connected with the idea of territorial expansion. They do not just sit and protect their own territory, they want to attack and acquire new territories to protect it and expand. And the third is the idea of liberating Russia from the Western ideas. They think that all the troubles of modern Russia started under Peter the Great when he took too much from the West. And that's what Dugin and Shchelin and some other conservatives are talking about. So this is the collection they have, and I would postulate that it cannot stand any scrutiny. When people are saying that Dugin is a philosopher, okay, I can grant him that, he may be a philosopher, but let's look at the individual points that he makes. What is the special path of Russia? What does he mean by that? Special Russian philosophy. Philosophy is a science that deals with necessary and universal, de facto, what touches upon all people, and it doesn't apply any specific path for a certain country. So, okay, what would be somewhat unique philosophic ideas from Russia? How long ago did they occur? That would start with Vladimir Solovyov, the second part of 19th century. Chadaev was the first original thinker in Russian Empire. He was closer to the middle of the 19th century, and very quickly he was denounced and accused of being insane. Who else was there? There were Westerners, there were Slavophilics, but those are not unique. They're just retelling of German and French works of that time. Slavophiles, they were pushing the ideas of Slavic world having its own significant difference from the West. Europe had already went further from that, but Russian philosophers and conservatists still feed off that body of knowledge. So their philosophy is original in the fact that it is old, that it is moldy, that it consists of old and regurgitated European ideas. Now there are other philosophers there, like Shchelin, who state that the pinnacle of Russian uniqueness was during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. His land management system, his court system, Russian law at that time, rights and regulations that were somewhat different. But if we look at the Germany of that time, they had a very similar logic, same, or it was called slightly different, but it was the same logic of court system. And even there, Russia is very much alike European ideas. The idea of the just court, idea of self-management, self-governance, what Ivan the Terrible actually allowed at that time, which is somewhat different from the current Moscow approach. This is the complex of European ideas, and Russia was always, hang on Alexei, so we also do understand that it was Ivan the Terrible who devised a mechanism of oprichnina to destroy all those noble bloods who were competing in his kingdom for power with him. So he basically destroyed them in order to preserve his own power. That's what was the main difference between him and Europe and Europe's development in the next stage. Europe had a lot more diversity because never they had such a concentration of power that occurred under Ivan the Terrible in Russia. And basically this European vector at that stage of history of Russia, Ivan the Terrible basically chopped it off with his rough instrument of oprichnina, of his enforcers. He forced all the bloodlines, all the other pretenders to the throne. He forced them into deep hiding and created conditions for dark times and the crisis that followed his reign that Moscow kingdom was struggling with during the whole 17th century. Well, it depends how you look at this, Yuri. There was also the wars of white and red roses and other somewhat similar connotated events in Europe. But what I wanted to say is that Russia was successful from Ivan the Terrible to Basil III to Stalin or Stolypin. It was successful when it acted like Europe. All the great Russian literature, Russian music, Russian art of the 19th century is European culture based on Russian material. It's European canonical culture and art interpreted on the Russian material. created by people who were educated in the European education system. Every time Russia deviated from European path, they fell into either worst of the wildest Asian approaches in that sense, or it was very ineffective. So my simple suggestion to these philosophers would be to present at least one original Russian idea that genetically, I don't know how else to call it, originates completely in Russia, has roots in Russia. They're calling themselves catechon. Right, France used to call itself too. They're saying Orthodoxy goes from Russia, that's Russian native belief, but that is East Roman Empire, that is European. And this is an entirely European idea. It grew based on the works of ancient Greeks, like Plato and such. Basically, what Orthodoxy is an entirely European project. And to juxtapose Orthodox Christianity to Protestantism, it's like juxtaposing Catholicism with Protestantism. You're just comparing different Western ideas. Even the Soviet project was an entirely Western idea. Communism is a European idea. Everything that was there, all the pinnacles of Russian development and all the major milestones are based on European ideas. Now, adding new territories, territorial acquisitions. Dugin and Shchelin are talking now that Russia should include Belarus and Ukraine because they have been cut off its body and we need to aggregate the whole body together. Okay, perhaps, but then a question. Why, having the biggest territory of all the country in the world, you cannot bring order to it? You're failing to develop it, and yet you continue encroaching on your neighbors, to Ukrainians and to Belarus, pretending that you have some 3 branches of great Russian peoples. Okay. Why? What are you bringing to us? You bring us Bucha, destroyed Mariupol, torture chambers for kids in Kherson. What's so precious you're bringing to us? Your super original ideas and expansionist ideas. And the third is liberating from the Western imprisonment that Dugin peddles so much that we need to put Russian original dress and behave like original Russians, and that will be our original culture. Well, excuse me, how many years did you have to bring that original culture? You could have been bringing that original culture in the 19th, in the 20th, in the first half of the 21st century. Where is that original culture? That's one. Second, why and what from will you assemble that original culture? Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, that's Europe. Tchaikovsky, also Europe. Mussorgsky, Europe. All the scientists, all the physicists, from Vernadsky and the like, these are all European ideas, European thinking based on European standards, developing European science. Show us something that is not European, that you have succeeded in building. They're also trying to rely on another pillar. Old believers before Niconian Reformation, that's also European culture. What is there non-European that is smart, that was developed there, that is useful? What Western imprisonment are you going to get rid of? If you are going to do that, you need to get rid of everything from ballet that you're proud of to space exploration and achievements. Alexei, I think we can also concentrate some attention here that one of the most important subjects in and scenarios in Russian history is a continuous struggle in Russia after Peter the Great, the struggle between the European values and the old Russian values. Because that thin layer of the golden and silver ages, as they're referred to in Russian culture, they're usually being brushed away, shunned, destroyed during another iteration of return to, quote, original Russian. And what we're seeing now is another iteration of that. Oh, right, yeah, the most repressed people were the ones who were bringing Russia closer to Europe, who were developing science, who were developing art. So that's why I don't see truth in that approach that Dugin peddles. And fourth is they are very light on understanding and taking ideas in Russian conservatism. They think that an idea is Shchelin or Dugin sitting thinking for half a year they'll write a book, and this book will have a ton of original ideas in it. One can say that ideas, real ideas, they grow on decades of a very high level of interaction of smart, well-educated people. It's awesome when you have a whole layer of these people in your country or across countries who have a total freedom of expressing themselves and their thoughts. Then you may have a chance of giving birth to Kant and people alike. Because a lot of modern philosophic school grew based upon his works. But he also showed up as a result of decades of educational approach where people could study, had a chance to study, had a chance to express themselves. So somebody needed, what I'm going to is somebody needs to be maintaining this lawn for decades, for hundreds of years, until somebody bright like Vernadsky or Mendeleev come about shining. So when Russia eventually got this lawn from Europe, they managed to cultivate their stars. What about now? They have totalitarian society. Russia turned its worst side to its society now. Authoritarian, totalitarian, all-encompassing. How are they going to birth new ideas there? What would be the soil for upbringing these new ideas there? The soil of that moldy old history with KGB in power? I don't think you can birth anything out of it. KGB has only methods, they don't have ideas. And the atmosphere in the country that they bring with it, where you'll be put down into prison system for 7 years after you express any idea, and then destroyed and killed like Navalny, that system will not birth any ideas, either European or non-European. This atmosphere does not empower any ideas to grow. And everything they aspire to be is essentially old Europe that they're still trying to fight with. So my resume is simple. The idea of special civilization, Russian originality, is a very hodgepodge, concocted, full of internal disconnects, ideological copy that is being also covered with a trend to expansion, to human rights suppression, in favor of government idea, the idea of a strong government. What is somewhat unique for Russia, probably also in China though, is that the country takes, the government and the country as a system takes the center post and replaces even God with it. Everything else is taken from orthodoxy, from scientific ideas, and it is all used to explain and justify the worshipping of the state. So if you listen to Dugin and Shchelin in depth, trying to understand, when you bring Bucha, for example, you guys killed 500 women and children and elderly.
In Izum, we discovered the graves of 468, out of them only 8 are adult males. Mariupol destroyed to ruins, torture chambers in Kherson, right, in other places they occupied. What Shchelin is saying, as a response to that, look at the Old Testament. There are morally disgusting people there, and look, God has made something good out of them at the end. And that justification of absolutely satanic actions by Bible, this is not an original idea. This is an original move by Russian conservatism, and original in quotes, because this is an old idea. As it's said in the Bible itself, Satan loves to quote the Bible. And in my view, Shchelin is simply a brilliant example of that tragedy that is happening with Russian intellectuals, with many of them. A person is borderline genius, often genius. A person who has or had rather big future ahead of him, extraordinary mind, great talent, personal talent to understanding things. But he is down to the brain cell. He identifies himself with Russian Federation, and he dedicates his talent to reinforcing the state, to the religion of state in Russia, and he justifies everything. The torture becomes holy torture, cruelty becomes heavenly cruelty, the desire to subdue everybody becomes biblical wisdom, a lot of incorrect substitutions. And luckily there were more people in Russia who answered to all these magicians in quotes. who like to twist and turn the truth. Strugatsky brothers, the famous sci-fi writers from Soviet Union, answered back then all of these things. They said, if your great ideas require you to do shitty things to achieve them, then your great ideas are shitty, are full of it. And basically, if your great catacomb or shining city on the hill that you're going for in Moscow, if for that you need to kill children in Ukraine, that means your idea is horrible. Just like Christ said, you'll learn them by their deeds, by their actions. So if your idea breeds places like Mariupol and Bucha, then the price of your ideas is horrible. The core of your ideas is horrible. And by the way, they do know that they cannot stand rational critique. If one decides to dissect their original so-called ideas, they would fall apart. And that's why they have... And by the way, in Russia, philosophy hasn't really evolved. Historiosophy, theosophy, philosophy, it didn't quite work in Russia. They failed to produce a school of thought, and that's why they often fall into a deep mysticism. The moment, that's their characteristic feature, the moment you try to talk with them seriously, they fall into mysticism. They resort to that, and they start writing Tsar with a big letter, catacomb, Kitish town. Right, Alexei, where the heck did they find all these catacombs and Kitishes and ancient mythical things in their Russia? What's that, their erotic fantasy? And sorry, I want to interject here because I have one viewer who left a couple comments. Exactly what you're talking about. Dugin accuses Protestantism. Problem is that Russian pseudo-Christianity and Protestantism, they take their root from Gnosticism and early Christianity. And Shchelin mentioned that Gnosticism is a pre-ontology that's difficult to grasp. I had a guest in my stream a couple days ago who mentioned that from Russians one often feels some exacerbated pride, like a special characteristic. And Gnosticism, as he says, is one of the catches of pride, of one of the worst sins, because it helps to justify the other sins. And Shchelin from material Gnosticism is falling, seems like, into mythical Gnosticism. So that transformation that allows him to justify any murder, saying that this is coming from God, there's a great idea behind it. Oh, right, yeah, he's saying that we have a direct analogy in Old Testament, and that is justified just because it was mentioned there. And Kitishgrad, Kitish town, that mythical place as well can be discussed. But one needs to understand what is the core of Western conservatism. Everything needs to be on the basis of hard rationalism. When we're talking about political rights or rights of peoples to choose their living, there is a rational basis that stands on the century-old tradition of research and methodology, or one can swing into mysticism and say that in Kitish town everything is so different, that when it was on the bottom of the lake everything was exactly horrible, and then it rises from there and it cancels a lot of things, and it changes. This is a good legend. One can shoot a beautiful kids' cartoon based on that, with dark warriors fighting the warriors of light, and read that to children as a fairy tale, but how do you build rational politics on that? No, how? Also, right in time, Russian Stat just published new polling results about the Easter. Most people treat it as tradition. 1/3 doesn't even know what it is about. The resurrection of Christ was answered by only 42%. 32% didn't know what to answer. Among other options, suggested to the pollers the birth of Christ, the rising of Christ, and celebrating spring, 2%. Overall, Russians treat Easter as cultural tradition, 30%, family tradition, 24%, or formal, 13%. Among Russians who consider themselves to be Christians, only 10% are going to the overnight service in church. Among Russians overall, it's only 8% that are going to church for Easter. So that's your, in quotes, conservative country, as they think in the West about Russia. In this regard, Ukrainians are more conservative and Christian nation. It's just that our state is conducting left-leaning or sometimes even about politics. That's why it's difficult for us to represent our true self to the world. But I want to say here that I will have a chance to talk to Jordan Peterson soon, and we already arranged the date and time. I think I'll start our discussion with this data, with this statistical polling from Russia, because I do respect Western conservatism and their representatives, had a lot of discussions with them, but among other things, I want to highlight that they have a somewhat deformed opinion about Russian conservatism, and I want to work on that field quite a bit to make sure they understand what, how, and when it is in real life. So, from the philosophic point of view, for people who have read at least 4 dialogues of Plato, a little bit of Aristotle, maybe Kant, even briefly, that core of ideas cannot stand any criticism. Andrei Bormester, in one of his streams about philosophy of Dugin, we probably should talk to him again, he said an interesting thing. I looked at the number of books written by Dugin, and I started to have certain concerns that no serious researcher can write that many books a year, because serious research takes time. And that looks more like he's a graphomaniac, some sort of an idea that births a lot of writing, and that is not exactly science. And what's curious about that specific collection of a special path, a catechon, some miracles during the times of Ivan the Terrible, might trick some of the simpler kind of Russians to die in droves and thousands somewhere in ditches in Ukraine. How unpretentious their public is, how rationality hasn't taken its root in Russia to such a degree that just that basic discussion about the culture, about uniqueness, can bring tens of thousands of them to die in our muddy ditches. And the problem of Russia that it keeps trying to rise but keeps losing doing it. And our task is to explain to the West what is Russian conservatism. And the healthy conservatism is actually the most repressed figure in Russia. And one also needs to understand Russia to add a criminal culture. The Word of a Thug, the recent TV series, what they consider to be conservatism. And that's what I'm trying to explain on the West, that when they criticize LGBT, it's not because they're conservatives, but because they're criticizing it from the criminal culture. That's because of the criminal attitude to the rainbow people. And it's not a conservatism opinion here in the West, it's a really thuggish approach to that matter. Under Stalin, a third of adult males served time in prison. And what you often take for conservatism is actually a mirror of a reflection of their criminal culture, taking root in society. That's why my resume is rather simple. Where Russia was giving world-grade examples, it was doing it only because the people of European culture were working in European canonical world, in the European genre. When Russia tried to be original, that was always losing. They were often producing some funny projects that are not standing to scrutiny. And those people who were bringing in the light of Europe, the light of rationality to Russia, they were often most repressed. They were expunged, starting from Chadaev, the first original thinker in Russia who was declared insane. And that core of ideas by Dugin and the like, it is very clumsy, somewhat funny, pretty crude, you know, like kids glue the gerbarium for their school. It's a funny arts and crafts thing, like a little house glued together that you can open doors, but you can see stains of glue everywhere, rough cutouts that can be liked only with a total dislike to rationality. Back in Pushkin times, he said that we are dumb and not curious. Only there that may motivate somebody. And Russians present their deep psychological issue a deep complex of inferiority, which they dress up to be their original idea. It is a known thing in psychology. It can be often called a man with a twist, and here we have a civilization with a twist. Right, Alexei, with the civilization with a twist, looking for a mythical rescue and salvation. Right, and that twist, if you examine it, turns out to be a set of primitive psychological ideas and feelings of inferiority, but apparently they are valuing it. It's their precious thing because they have nothing else. And this is the Russian story. This is the story of Russian conservatism. And trust me, I've read enough, and I keep reading all these Slavic files and the works of past, the works of the future. There is nothing to hold in your hands, really. Yuri, it is such a crude collection that, I don't know, that's why I'm comparing it with a 6-year-old arts and crafts who very often concoct a much more quality, higher quality product. That's what happens in Russia when they try to be original. Look, Alexei, there's an interesting moment here, and we have some Russian bots writing in our comments on your site, on my stream. Why are you not asking about your own citizens in Ukraine, about Easter? Ask the people at large and you'll get same answers. Well, we can answer that. We don't have such a pathos. We're not promising the nuclear ash to frame the picture of us winning over the world and our search for truth. We, at the very least, in Ukraine are much more reasonable, much more rational, and not so pretentious. Right, we're more rational. And frankly, if one does the polling, I'm not sure that it'll match. Even if we will not be 100% accurate, we are not trying to erase London into nuclear ash because we do not think that our lack of knowledge is our special path. Because in Russia, that's exactly what they put on the pedestal. And the lack of ideas and the scarcity of them and the lack of understanding of their source is what is being trumpeted in Russia as a virtue. And Russia is good. It had times when it was great, when it behaved entirely. The elite of Russia behaved as Europe. That's when Russia was great. So, however, it is uncomfortable for our anti-Russian sentiment to hear Russia actually produced world-class product when they were thinking as Europeans, when they were acting as Europeans, when European minds were allowed to lead for brief periods of their history. And when they're saying now that Orthodoxy is not West, well, Orthodoxy is West. What is Greece? East Roman Empire, right? Little example. This is your Europe. This is the core of Europe's civilization too. And if one tells to Gregory of Ptolemy or Basil the Great that they're not Europeans, they'll be utterly surprised. I think you can also approach Peterson from several things you just mentioned, that lack of knowledge is a special path, that if one can build further on that, that knowledge is hell, and the like. Well, look, Yuri, Peterson and Western conservatists, they're not too simple. It's going to be an interesting discussion, but they are seeing only the outward interface of Russia, represented by Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy, those fantastic examples generated by the West-leaning Russia. They barely know the core Russia that stands behind it, and it takes a bit of work to help them understand it and learn it. But we should not be just laughing it off. We need to discuss it in depth, and I'm preparing for it. We'll have an interesting talk. But here, us people inside that culture, we can of course be laughing at it, because we understand that to a much deeper degree by the fact of growing in it. You know, what is originality in Russia? Imagine a school class with 5th graders learning physics. All of a sudden, the door opens with a kick, and a huge guy, much older than them, comes in because he was left for 3rd year in the 5th grade, spits on the floor, takes a seat in the back, takes out the harmonica and says, "So, what you doing here?" The teacher of physics adjusts his glasses and says, "Well, could you maybe elaborate on the law of Newton?" And he gets an answer that it's only on the rotting teacher's table that these ideas are of any interest. We don't care about that. We only care about our national shirt, and we're dancing and At that time, the other students to the left and to the right of him look at him. At that time, the other students around in the class are looking at this fella and thinking, oh my God, we've won and studied and put so much effort and learning languages, and here's that creature. And that contradiction of a smart school kid, which Pavel Shchelin was when he first came to Ukraine, invited to be shot in the series of the smart kids, and that fellow who doesn't need anything, that's the tragedy of Russian people. That's the main fault line, the basic imbalance contradiction between Dugin and Dostoevsky. And when Dugin is trying to use Dostoevsky to draw some anti-West agenda, he doesn't even understand that Dostoevsky is a perfect critique of the Western project within the Western project, within the European project, because it includes both the east of Europe, Orthodoxy, and the west of Europe with Catholicism and the rest. Well, look, Alexei, there is one more important element in our discussion, is that question of freedom. Who in Russia is really free? Because we see that even those who leave the framework of the country, who go abroad, they still bring that mental virus with them that is directed at enslaving people to the state. Remember, D'Agustin, in his memoirs of 1839, he was describing that there's only one free person in Russian Empire, the emperor. Right, only the Tsar. Everybody else just compete in trying to prove their loyalty and seeing something godlike in his actions and proving their importance, functional importance to him, that determines their material well-being. They can be granted by the shining sent by the emperor. Yeah, that's an old anecdote of the Soviet times, when everything for the person, everything in the name of the person. Right, I was in Moscow, I've seen that person. And the emperor is not free as well. The person who is subduing 40 million citizens like Nikolai or Alexander I, he cannot be free. However much you task Speransky with writing constitution, which was never ratified at those years, they had European thinker, a giant. Napoleon, as a joke, offered Alexander I any of the German kingdoms in exchange for Speransky. But what did they do with him in Russia? Same Alexander, who gave them the task to write constitution, he eventually degraded him, expunged him, and got him forgotten, together with the whole aspiration to write a constitution. So it's rather simple. Western conservatives are for the rights and freedoms of an individual in their original reading. Western civilization works on honing the uniqueness of a person and integrity of a self. And Russian idea is based on the importance of the state. And when bright people like Shchelin or Dugin start to serve the idea of the state, they first of all lose their idea of themselves as a person, as an individual, because they essentially castrate themselves and their capabilities in favor of state and wild statism. And it's interesting, an interesting feature there is that they immediately abandon the idea of ethics. They can be ethical and noble and otherwise in their personal life, but at the moment when they fall under the influence of state and that idea of state importance, there is no idea that they cannot justify with the importance for the state, however horrible the idea or action is, because state trumps all. All right, and I actually brought an example yesterday that one of the phrases by Pavel Shchelin, who said, well, we need to preclude the revolution among the elites in Russia, just chop the heads off on Rublevka Street where the elites live. And this is, I think, the great illustration of what you just said, alluded to. And that bloodthirstiness that keeps being reproduced by that Gnostic intellectualism is rather concerning. How, in a moment, in the blink of an eye, one can turn from an intellectual into a bloodthirsty creature who embodies that death wish. Yeah, that's a good lesson for us, Yuri. Heidegger, by the way, for a good example, he was praising Hitler. He betrayed all of his students. If he was a genius philosopher,
But if French would not have reanimated him and he wouldn't have served and worked in some of the universities after the war, then in Germany he would never be accepted back again. Rightly so. We have philosopher Shchelin, who basically is kissing hands of Putin, the dictator. Well, not physically. He doesn't do that to him or to Cyril, the head of Russian Orthodox Church, but he is kissing the hands of the idea. And he put his life and talent and heart to justify a very primitive, very anti-humanistic, expansionist ideology that even in this is, in its core, is not original. It was all invented back in the day. Back in Assyria, thousands of years ago, 3,000 years ago, that it was invented there. They're praising the state. And mausoleum in the shape of ziggurat, that's a good monument to all that. Like in 1930s, Moscow press was actually writing that a mausoleum will be built in the cheerful Assyrian style. What do you think? Here we have some questions from our viewers. Alexei, what do you think are the roots of this idea? Why this is so popular in Russia, in Moscow, Russia? Where is that mutation coming from? Well, I was writing about that a while ago. I think it's the civilization of the swamps. When Kievan Knyaz, Kievan dukes uncorked those societies that lived in the swamps of northwest Russia, they let the spirit out into the wild, into the world. There are analogs in world culture. Poland and Mazowiecki swamps, Britain, and there are some of the interactions with their swamp-based cultures. They all birthed the cult of death in some shape. I actually had an article about Father Frost, who that figure was originally in Russia. It is a very cannibalistic set of cults and death cults that popped here and there in Africa, in India. Brits had some experience in fighting with them. Poles fought them in the Mazowiecki swamps. There's a great movie with Pierce Brosnan about India when, at the end of the 18th century, there was a sect of thugs, the stranglers, who strangled over 1 million people in lieu of 2 years. And he was an officer. They were doing that to honor the god Kali. And he was born in India. He spoke the local language, but he was of European descent. And he infiltrated that organization and destroyed it. One European destroying the whole cult. Here, unfortunately, in Moscow, that lasted much longer. And I see these things, these cultures, as ulcers on the body of humanity. So everything that was there to the north of Moscow, there are those chthonic cults. And their origins is a separate discussion, but we somehow uncorked it, and it was presented to the God's light and the world at large, and it's still here. And it keeps using the idea of Moscow statehood as a historic basis for its existence. Plus, add the influence of Mongols, East Roman Empire, Byzantine. More viewers are writing here that Shchelin is like dealing with Moscow. In the 17th century, Kiev tried to get them out of heresy, and several centuries later, they're still there. Yeah, they're saying that the main tragedy of Moscow history, it broke over the Niconian reform, because when they started to unite with Ukraine, they figured that we serve our Christian processes in Greek, and they have their own original Russian Orthodoxy. And Nikon enforced the Greek reform on them, and the old believers, they left the right books, their mythical texts, etc., in certain libraries, and they were expunged from Moscow. But I'm also thinking that, not to offend all those old believers, that whatever Dugin brings out from them now, if you take an old book of their times and the Greek origin, I would think that the Greek would be probably more elegant, even in terminology. So
This is a very interesting urge to describe the ill-equipped bath outhouse and the backyard for a modern new standard. It kind of fails. So what's your originality? Well, yeah, we don't have a porcelain outhouse, porcelain toilet. We have an outhouse in the back with made of wood. And I understand, in some degree it's original, but perhaps there is a better way to do it. How about you build proper bathrooms, you bring gas to your villages, explain what Easter is to your people, perhaps then you'll have some original ideas. Is Tolstoy original? Yeah, he is very original. In the world culture and here in academic environment in the West, I see people in their 50s sitting down to learn Russian to be able to read Dostoevsky and Bulgakov in the original language, because they think it's very original. So, yeah, you can build on that instead. But the problem is that all these guys, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc., they are very European. They're with European origins. So if you talk about Russian culture, they gave absolutely genius examples in the 19th century, but they have not invented any single original literary genre. That was all created in the framework that was devised by French, for example, invented by French. And great. We're glad to have it, and all that is warmly welcome. How Dostoevsky cannot be welcomed? He is still one of the top issued or published authors in the West. But even making a step back to see a big picture, I still have a question. Why do you want to be original? Why you're so stubbornly wanting to be somewhat original? Very similar to a 13-year-old teenager who is trying to be different. He cannot reach the serious originality because for that you need to invest a lot more time with your mind, soul, and body. But he's trying to be original just for the sake of originality. And then these guys are laughing at the wokeism in the West and Russia. But if you look at them under a lens, Dugin is the same woke as they are fighting on the West, except for Western woke, they're 19, 25, randomly 35 sometimes, but Dugin is 65 and he is still woke. He's still trying to be extremely original. And what for? Why do you want to be more original than Plato? What is the end goal? Do you want to outdo Aristotle as well? Well, this could be a deeply concealed feeling of lesser importance, that you are secondary. When a person insists on proving that he is so original, I think it stems from the feeling of inferiority. Right, I think this is the core of it. And they had some good examples that are proving that they're absolutely non-secondary. They had those glimpses in history. For example, Ivan the Terrible had the best artillery in Europe, the largest, the most precise, and that includes mathematics, weights, calculations. So why are you not proud with your real achievements? Why do you need to be original in something else where you haven't? In the area of special path, right? They're still failing to describe it, though. Chadaev starts his letters with writing that I'm looking at our huge empire from Kaliningrad to Kamchatka. Can you imagine? Back in those days, it's like from here to Mars, lasting so far. All the bureaucracy, all the apparatus, all the police, all the structures in the army, but the soul doesn't have a purpose. He underlines that all that machine has no purpose. He is asking a question, why are we? What is the goal of it? And he is failing to find an answer. And that's where he starts his research. So that's what I'm asking. What is your goal? And they're saying, okay, well, we want to capture the whole Ukraine till Lvov. All right, you got it. Imagine you took Lvov. What next? You killed Romanenko and Arestovich, executed everybody else against you, killed another million, or maybe most of them fled. And you populated it with people from, I don't know, Omsk and Kamchatka. What do you do next? Go to Wisla and Warsaw? What for? You have already the hugest territory in the world. You can dedicate yourself to bettering it. You have the whole Mendeleev's chemical table there, all the natural resources. You can go to space, right? Russian space takes a certain part in the culture. And yeah, they can play on that field. You've opened that door for humanity and you can continue moving this way.
Why do you go to Lvov? You cannot build a spaceport there. It's very uncomfortable to launch a rocket from that latitude. You need to go down south. Right, then they should go to India. Like Zhirinovsky, their political eccentric leader, said, go to India to wash your shoes in the Indian Ocean. Now again, why that? Let's repeat Bomestiev here. Is India a special way, special path? Is South Korea or Japan a special path? These are the countries that keep their traditional core, and they're building a somewhat liberal society around it, and a very lively economy around it. Why don't you go this way? But the problem is that for this, you need a liberal society, and for Russia, liberalism is death. They don't like it. And they understand, probably they, somewhere on the subconscious, they understand that if they bring enough liberalism, then this whole territory held by force might just fall apart. And that's a concern. That's why they try to stay away from it, I think. Because their ideology just ends up being trying to be overpowering to their neighbors. And if they're not so, then they stop being noteworthy. Well, I want to note here that, look, they got rid of all of the rulers who tried to do any liberal reforms. Alexander II, Nicholas II, Gorbachev. Every attempt to liberalize something ended in tragedy. Right. Kill them, throw a bomb, tear the legs off. So today, for example, they're trying to threaten Kazakhstan. And another question, all your originality, perhaps this originality is originality of a teen who is going to the 6th grade at 15, being left there for the 3rd time, and he is more original than his classmates because he is bigger and stronger. Well, then go compete with the real adults, like with China, for example, with the United States. And, for example, China recently launched their expedition to take lunar soil samples from the other side of the moon. And the funniest part is that China doesn't really have original space program. They copied Soviet technology. Indians, they did their own original. Every design, every bolt and nut, their own. Chinese just copied the Soviet stuff. What about Russia? How many times they have postponed the last launch? They've degraded their own industry with all that war and all that special path. You can see the lack of ideology with all the videos they're sending from the front. That idiotic wasting of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people there in the Ukrainian soil. For what? For that obscure collection of ideas, which is neither a collection nor an idea, if you look at it under a microscope. This is not even a system, this is just an aggregation of random puzzles from different pictures, which they brought into a single box. They're shaking and rattling it near the ear, and they hear the mystical sound of the ocean waves there, and that's their uniqueness. That's what I want to say, Russians. How about you start thinking? Well, you know, that's what I want to outline, that Russians are brilliant when they're Europeans. When they align with Europe, they have original thought, they have scientific and other achievements. But the moment they go into that land of mysticism, they turn into something weird, just like Shchelin did recently. He was brilliant here in the West. He spent 10 years getting his education, writing works, but the moment he got hijacked by that Russian Orthodox Church, disease of his brain, he kind of self-castrated himself. He basically chopped himself up and put himself in a right box to make sure he fits. I'm following him, looking where his thought is going, and he tried to go somewhere in the original way that you'd want to listen and see where he ends up, and then all of a sudden his internal control turns on, that externality turns on that says, no, don't go there, that's not applicable, and if you are going there, you have to explain it from the point of view of state. And that's how he's killing himself as a thinker. I see a big tragedy in this, but it is a very teaching tragedy, because a lot of people who are even rather removed from philosophy, but who are familiar with his work, they can see how that cancer of soul eats him up. And he voluntarily jumped there, right? As the usual selling of soul to the devil is always a voluntary action. Right, he was also fighting with Gnosticism in his early works. He was criticizing it so much, but ended up falling prey to it in its in its worst variant, in its rather mythical variant. I don't know. Even a second grader should see that this is rather dusty and moldy with that collection of ideas. But the person like Shchelin should have seen through, but he probably found something interesting for himself there, right? That proper Russian Federation citizen. All right. In this regard, I think we had a rather fiery stream today. Hang on, I got a bit more stats. Let's polish it with one more. 4th place in the world on the number of divorces. Does that look like conservative state? 9% of Christians go to church. It's only 4% of the whole population. 650,000 kids are in a state-run homes for children. 50% of women and children ran and met with home violence. So I'm getting some comments here from viewers that they're good at managing smaller populations of different peoples because of the overwhelming numbers that they possess. But it's much harder for them to operate with Ukraine, for example. And that's the role of Ukraine. This is the place where Russian idea fails for centuries. They can sell it to the West even. They can sell it to the East, but they cannot sell it here. And that's why one of the reasons of their deep and principal hatred to us, because we know them, we see through them. We're the authors. We invented the Russian Empire and Soviet Union for them, and Nikonian reform was also our invention. And it just doesn't fly. That collection of ideas goes nowhere in Ukraine. So you can deceive Tucker. You can try to go around Peters. You can maybe figure out how to make Musk like you. But then they bump into Romanenko and nothing works, because as a person with historical education, or any other more or less educated Ukrainian student, he looks at that and sees through it. Even people without high education here, they would still get it that they're being sold complete idiocy. And there's nothing to sell in Ukraine from Russia. And their wish to destroy the carriers of that rebellious gene, that gene of non-buying, their concoction that looks decent through the interface of Dostoevsky, but 40 millions of Ukrainians know what they're talking about. And this is very psychologically unstable creature with inferiority complex who stayed there for 3 years in that class and trying to dominate everybody in it. But then there is a joker in a class who's looking at this dude and laughing, and just keeps laughing at his attempts to be superior. That hatred cannot be sold here, and they want to destroy it. Because then they hope that they'll be able to deceive the whole world. No, that won't work. There are always us who will tell Tucker, who will help Peterson to understand who are you in reality. And the only path for you really is to become Europeans. When you'll become once, we can work together. But with your original ideas, as you're peddling them now, I kind of doubt you can, at least not at the moment. I think this is a brilliant stream. You gave me joy as in good old times. I'm reading the comments in the chat. Everybody is laughing and supporting. So thank you. Thank you for well-formulated thoughts on this topic. I think we can cut a lot of shorts out of this and continue sending this message. I also urge our audience to use the material, to cut it in pieces and make shorts in different social networks. Make sure you click the like button, make sure you subscribe, as well as to the privateer station if you're listening that in English. And I think in that fight with the so-called Russian world, that's important, what you do. And as one of the viewers is writing, of course, we can abandon and forget Shchelin, but it's important to look at his example to understand what happened there so we can preclude and prevent others from falling into that pit. And yeah, this is the goal of this stream. I, again, would outline that this is the inferiority complex and the feeling of being second, of being lesser, and this attempt to bring some obscure ideas in. This is not from a good life. They don't have something to grasp on. And you can only imagine the level of that inferiority if, for that, they're eager to die by tens of thousands in dirty ditches, in mud and rain, where they're not even being picked by their own recovery teams. Can you imagine the crack, the tectonic crack that goes through their soul when they use something that is kind of like toilet paper, like wet toilet paper that just falls in your hands, and they still use it as something to lean upon. So Russia is a deeply broken state deep inside. This is a big trauma that it has. You can record probably another stream about the origins of it. But any cure is good to fix that. If their ideas were even twice more primitive, they would have even grasped on those. But the main thing is that it's all a lie. It's all a facade. The numbers that we quoted, more than 500,000 kids in state-run foster homes. I would remind you that in Italy, there is not a single child in a state-run home like that. For them, this is your conservative country, because for them, it's wrong when kids are in state-run foster homes. Since the 15th century, they don't exist. The towns, the communities took it upon them. In Florence, there is still a building where the kids were taught, where they were given future. And in Russia, we have more than 500,000 kids. That's a conservative country that values children, that values life and future. Well, amen to that. Once again, don't forget to click like, subscribe, support the link to the fundraisers for Ukrainian armed forces. Right, we're collecting some funds for radio electronic interference to prevent Russian drones for destroying our vehicles that are evacuating wounded soldiers from the front. Right, under mine, there is also a link to Special Operations Fundraiser. They're gathering some money for their equipment. You can read more in the link. And again, everybody, Happy Easter, those who celebrate. Let's hope that you know what you are celebrating, right? Unlike them. They are the holiday of spring. Indeed, right. Well, with this, thank you, Alexei. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, dear viewers, for being with us. And see you next time. Have a good weekend.